Joining us this morning to talk about the war in Iran and DHS funding is Congressman from Florida, Mike Haridopolos of the Financial Services Committee, a member there. Good morning. Thanks so much for being with us.
My pleasure. Great to see you again.
All right, let's dive right in. You support the U.S.-Israeli combat operations in Iran. Tell us why.
Well, I think most importantly, it's the threat of Iran. As you know, we've tried very much since literally 1979 to try to handle this situation. And as you know, they have lied consistently. When Barack Obama tried to work with them back in 2015, we even helped them out economically. They lied again about their nuclear ambitions. And now we realize once again, even though we knocked out much of their bunkers and so forth last year, they continued this effort to acquire a nuclear weapon. And as we're seeing over and over now during this conflict, they're not just shooting at Israelis and Americans. They're indiscriminately firing at all of their neighbors at places like hotels. And then your thing is really, evil is the only way to put it. These are people who killed tens of thousands of their own people. If they're willing to kill their own citizens, you can only imagine what they would do to the rest of the world with a nuclear weapon.
Well, there's obviously questions about, whether or not they were actually able to, as Trump said, have a nuclear weapon in 2 weeks. Tulsi Gabbard testified yesterday, basically saying that it was their intention to do so. The president has given a time frame of 4 to 6 weeks for these strikes to continue. We're almost at the end of week 3. How long do you believe that this operation is going to continue to last?
Well, I don't know all the ins and outs. I think we're all working with that. The good news is we have absolute air superiority at this time. We've knocked out so many of their missiles. The number of missiles they can fire has been dramatically reduced. I say between 90 and 95% fewer missiles than what started this conflict. We have put their Navy down in the bottom of the ocean. And, of course, their ability to project power has been radically reduced as well. And so we're going to have to see how this kind of plays out. They are now almost like a rat in the corner, just indiscriminately firing at civilian targets. Again, just shows the evil of this organization. And if you're in the leadership, your days are numbered. I hope this will end quickly. We all do. My own son is in the military, and we think about him and his friends and know how challenging this is. We do not want to put boots on the ground, obviously, in Iran either. We're optimistic that we can put such a hurt on Iran that they never go after these again. But I think the real issue here was, as Marco Rubio put it well, these folks were trying to create such a strong conventional force with drones and ballistic missiles that they could create a nuclear weapon in time. And, of course, not just dominate that region, but potentially with intercontinental ballistic missiles threaten the entire world.
Now, there have been some questions about how much information Congress is getting. Punchbowl has reported that the Senate and House GOP committee chairs have shown no urgency in getting public testimony from senior administration officials on the war, even as questions about its goals and its costs and its motives continue to mount. Democrats are now demanding public hearings from Hegseth, the Department of Defense Secretary Rubio, who is over at the State Department. Are you guys being adequately briefed, and would you support public testimony from these two?
Well, I think there needs to be a complete debrief of what's going on. No doubt about it. We're a very transparent society, and we think all the information is needed, not only for the cost of the war, but the justification for it. I think the justification is clear. Again, you see the evil of this country is they're killing their own citizens. You saw a couple of days ago, one of their star wrestlers was put to death. Now these young ladies who play soccer for them coming from Australia could be at risk. This is a real challenging situation. And again, Lou, I think it's a real telling sign. It's not just the United States and Israel are conducting these activities, but look at all of Iran's neighbors. They're taking the side of the U.S. and of Israel, who many of those countries have been longtime enemies of Israel. And so I think it's a positive sign that people have had enough of Iran, that their own neighbors are saying, we're going to side with the United States to try to take out this regime because they've caused so much havoc in the area. But to your general question, absolutely, we need to have these hearings. People need to know exactly what we did, how we accomplished the mission, much like we told what happened so successfully in Venezuela.
Now, something that Tulsi Gabbard said this week when she was testifying on Capitol Hill, she said after those June 2025 U.S. strikes with B-2 bombers that hit Iran's nuclear facilities, she said, quote, there have been no efforts since then to try to rebuild their enrichment capability. Obviously, we know that there is, Democrats have been highly critical of this. If the conflict becomes protracted or U.S. costs or casualties increase, will there be more oversight needed on how the Department of Defense and the president are doing these strikes?
That's a fair question. I'm glad you asked it because we do deserve to know. Again, I consider, of course, the Congress an equal branch with the executive branch, and we work in concert with them on most matters. And I think they need to show this was our plan, this is how we carried out our plan, and these are the objectives we met. We saw that very successfully in Venezuela. I think we're going to see the same in Iran. I mean, it's really telling, isn't it, that the entire ability for Iran to defend themselves has been radically reduced, and all they're doing now is trying to do almost like terrorist activities, trying to shut down the Strait of Hormuz, where approximately 20% of the oil comes in. But absolutely, we should have a full debrief of what happened. And if we feel like the whole story was not told, I think we need to be more aggressive about that. But they did have a meeting with the Gang of Eight, as you know, and that means Republicans and Democrats telling what the intentions of our efforts there on Iran would be, and hopefully what we would define success as.
Let's shift to the cost of war because you are on the Financial Services Committee. Multiple places, including the Times, have reported that the cost of the war has grown, exceeding $11 billion in the first week alone. I believe it was 6 days that they told lawmakers. The Post now reports that the Pentagon has asked the White House, who eventually will ask lawmakers to approve $200 billion in an additional funds for the Iran war. Would you support that number?
Well, first of all, let's find out what the number is. I mean, the number is high, there's no doubt. And we never want to have to spend money like this, but this is how you keep the world safe. Iran is a real threat. Their own neighbors recognize it. We recognize it. And these dollars are significant. I'm not sure what the total cost would be. But let's also look long term. The reason why we have so many assets in that region is because of the threat of Iran. We have all these bases that we have to spend money on, national defense, help out allies like Israel in these efforts. If Iran is finally neutralized, we don't have to spend as much money long term in places like Iran. That's a good thing. And this hotbed in our entire lifetime has been the Middle East. And if you can take out the head of the snake, because remember, it's Iran who fuels all of the terrorist activities. They are a state sponsor of terrorism. You knock that group out, and it creates a lot less spending needed in the future. But to your point, I'm not sure what that number will be.
Were you surprised to hear that number, $200 billion?
I think I was, because as you just mentioned, they said the first few days is $11 billion. How would it be 20 times more, right? But that said, remember, in places like Minnesota, they found really at least $10 billion in fraud. We're seeing much the same in the hospice fraud in California. This is why we need to be so aggressive in being more transparent with all spending, not just military spending. But I'm a person who believes in equal access to this transparency. Defense Department and Health and Human Services programs should all have more transparency, because we've seen a lot of fraud across the board in the government. And that's why Rick Scott and I have a bill that says every dollar we spend to be put online, and not just how much is spent, but who gets the money.
Yeah. And just who gets the money? The president earlier this year proposed $1.5 trillion Pentagon budget for the upcoming fiscal year, saying it would give him his dream military. Of course, that would be a 50% increase above current levels. If that $200 billion is what actually comes in, Pete Hegseth said it could go higher, it could go lower, but if that number is what actually comes in to lawmakers, should that count towards that $1.5 trillion that the president has asked for? I mean, these are huge numbers, right?
They are. And I think we're still early in the process. You know, we're going to pass the budget hopefully this fall. And I'd love to see a bipartisan budget. This is what we should do more of in Washington, D.C. But as you also know, in the Biden years, we spent a heck of a lot of money because of the Ukraine situation, the tragedy, what happened on October 7th in Israel, etc. We used a lot of our ammunition, so to speak, our stockpile, helping out Ukraine in their conflict with Russia. So we're rebuilding our military. And as you know, China is spending trillions of dollars on their military, trying to dominate that region. We need to take care of that threat. And of course, I chair the Space Committee, as you know, Jasmine, and that is another interest of ours, because that is such an important part of our military mission, because that's our eyes and ears around the world, GPS technology, etc.
Two more questions before we turn to some phone calls. We talked a little bit about the debt and deficit the last time that you were here, Congressman. Should additional war funding be paid by spending cuts elsewhere in the budget as an offset? Where would that money come from? And I know you said that you hope that the budget will be bipartisan, but would this new funding go through regular appropriations, or should it just go by party line?
Well, look, I think we should have regular negotiations. I mean, as you know, with the big fight we're having with the Department of Homeland Security, we passed this budget in the House, and they're fighting about it in the Senate, and that's why our agents at the airport aren't getting paid. We need to do this better, and that's why, again, I call for transparency. And as far as where the cuts would come from, the good news is we realize there is a lot of fraud in the system, and we can aggressively go out there. Remember, U.S. government doesn't spend cash and send the cash.
Is there $1.5 trillion of fraud in this country?
I think that I've seen as high as 10 to 15% of our entire budget is fraud, so that would really put a dent in it. The other good news is that our economy is stronger than it was a year ago. We're looking at a situation where the long-term growth for America is better, because that means a bigger pie means that even with the same tax rate, the same amount of money would actually increase instead of decrease.
All right, I want to ask you one last question before we get to some calls. But in an interview yesterday with an Orlando outlet, last week, you said, "I do not support the idea that we're going to put boots on the ground, let alone nation build. We have challenges here at home. That's where our focus needs to be." Yesterday, the president said that he would not deploy boots on the ground, but if he did, he wouldn't tell the press. But ABC is now reporting that the Pentagon's decision to send the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit, a 2,200 troop force, to the Middle East has raised questions about whether the Iranian conflicts could involve U.S. ground troops. Where are you on this? And for the American people who are watching, where is this all headed? Obviously, they're hearing these, whether or not, these Marines going into the Middle East. Where is this all going?
Well, first, I stand by my comment. I mean, none of us want boots on the ground in Iran. We want to win this conflict. And the good news, as we mentioned before, is that we have absolute air superiority. We can send our slow bombers, so to speak, over Iran now because there's no anti-missile threat for the most part. And we have dominated and we have knocked out a lot of their command and control structure. Their ability to project has also been radically reduced, which is a great thing. I do not support boots on the ground. I don't think anyone does. And what the president, I think, of course, is doing right now is what any smart business person would do, let alone elected leader would do, and that's to have as many options as possible. But we're all optimistic we can win this conflict, take away the ability for Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon, and hopefully the Iranian people, not United States, but the Iranian people will say enough is enough, considering the fact that women don't have any rights in Iran, as you know, whether it be what they wear, let alone when they testify in court, or their rights in a marriage. And so let's hope this is a day for Iran and that they can get back to where they were in 1979 as far as rights for individuals as opposed to where they've been for the last 47 years.
Would you consider the military taking over Karg Island, obviously that oil island that the president struck, which produces 90% of the oil for Iran? Mm-hmm. If the military were to go there, would you consider that boots on the ground?
I think that people would see that as an occupation of a vital economic interest. I think I've always considered boots on the ground as a history teacher is literally where we would occupy an entire country,
like
run that country.
Like
we did after World War II in Japan, right? And so we all have a horrible taste in our mouth of what happened in Iraq. And I'm sure our current leadership has learned a lot of lessons for that. But we know 20% of all the oil in the world comes from that area. And that, interesting enough, it's actually China that relies more on that oil than we do. The
China
good news,
and Japan.
And Japan, correct. And the other good news is that we're producing a heck of a lot more oil here in the United States, and now we have a friend, or at least a person we can work with in Venezuela to produce a lot more oil, so we're less dependent upon this part of the world.
David from Texas, a Republican. You're first. Good morning, David.
Good morning. I have a few things I'd like to get clarified. Why can't our elected officials have a debate and care more about the American people than they do the immigrants and everything? And why is it that Republicans would rather rewrite history than to actually do something about it? The Hormuz Straits, where are our minesweepers? They were sent from the Middle East back to the United States. And England asked the president, can we help? He told him no. We've got it under control. Well, now they want help from everybody. Let's debate. Let's get together. The ICE people are being funded. That was taken care of in July. It's nobody's fault but the Republicans, I believe, because they won't do something about ICE. So we're not paying TSA, and the American people are standing in line at the airport 3-4 hours. Get your stuff straight.
All right, David. Let me get the congressman an opportunity to respond there because he mentioned about 4 different topics.
I'll do the last one. I'll try to keep up with David here. First of all, remember we have funded ICE all the way till 2029. where we have already put in the budget, which I thought would be the most common sense thing that Democrats and I have talked about, and that is let's have body cameras for ICE agents. We need to understand what they face, especially when local law enforcement does not support them, like we saw in that tragedy in Minneapolis. The second thing is I do think they need more training because they're confronting things they're not used to. Usually when ICE comes in, local law enforcement supports them and they take out these bad guys or gals who committed a crime beyond, of course, coming into the country illegally, but once here committing a crime. There's actually a website called WOW, Worst of the Worst, .dhs.gov, and it outlines the people who came here illegally and the crimes that they committed. And in my home state, there's over 2,500 such individuals in Florida. But we have funded DHS in the House, as you know. They're fighting about it right now in the Senate. And I feel bad for these folks at the airport who are doing the job and not getting paid. I hope we can work something out. But again, if the fight is over ICE, hey, that debate already happened. We funded it till 2029. Let's all get together and agree that people who do a job should be paid for it, especially those who are protecting our homeland.
And I want to put a compromise that the White House sent over to Democrats this week as they're negotiating with the Senate. Democrats released a letter basically detailing what changes that they would be willing to concede to Democrats. That includes body cameras and expansion of the use of body cameras for federal agents, limit of enforcement in certain sensitive locations, including hospitals and schools, greater oversight of DHS detention facilities. This week we saw Markwayne Mullin, who is the nominee for DHS, basically saying that they would only use judicial warrants and not administrative warrants, something that the Democrats said that they wanted. Of course, that was not in this proposal, but they still seem far apart from what Democrats want. Democrats have said after this letter is sent that this is not enough. So where do you see the ability for Republicans and Democrats to compromise to reopen all of the government and fund the TSA agents and the Coast Guard and all the folks?
I mean, Jasmine, you did a great job. That's the White House trying to work with Democrats, conceding all of these points, saying we're willing to work with you on all these.
But it's not exactly what Democrats have asked for.
What I've seen in my brief time here in Congress, it seems like it's never enough for the Democrats. And sometimes when you try to work with them, I think they're more concerned about the politics of it all. My goal was to keep the TSA and the Coast Guard and FEMA funded, especially when you have a national tragedy like we might have in Florida with hurricanes. We saw, of course, those terrible floods in North Carolina. We saw the fires in California, let alone Hawaii. I mean, let's fund the government. And I'm happy to have, David brought up a great point. Let's have a debate. I love debate. And I think that's the kind of thing we need to do more of. But when you just say it's never enough seems to be the answer from Democrats too often. And even on the most common sense thing, we had a vote the other day saying basically if a person commits fraud, should they be kicked out of the country? Well, hell yeah, they should be. And so it's come to this case where I think they're more worried about losing a Democrat primary sometimes than they are trying to just solve a problem. The White House is willing to compromise. It seems like it's never enough for the Democrats, at least from the way I see it. And all I can do is what all I can do, which meaning we passed the budget in the House. The Senate, as you know, needs 60 votes to get at that full funding. I hope that they can work out a deal. And of all people, it's John Fetterman from Pennsylvania that seems to be the guy who's trying to find that middle ground, which is always appreciated in my book.
All right, Bob from Arkansas, a Republican. You're next. Go ahead, Bob.
I'd just like to make a comment about what Trump did over in Iran. I think he presented a nuclear Pearl Harbor. If you talk about the cost, what would be the cost to replace L.A. or New York?
Okay, that was Bob. I wonder if you respond to that.
Yeah, Bob from Arkansas. I'm actually a University of Arkansas graduate. We're just talking about before we got on the show today. And go Hogs, they had a big win last night against Hawaii. I'm optimistic they can do well. But that said, Bob, I think that's where the president eventually sided. He said, look, this is a real threat. And even remember the guy from Iran who basically gave us a lot of information about what was going on. He said, yeah, they were trying to acquire a nuclear weapon. And the way they would try to get it is by having so many drones and so many ballistic missiles that they would have a defense ring strong enough where they would not be harmed like they were last year. I just think that Iran has really telegraphed who they are. They're killing their own citizens. They're indiscriminately firing at hotels and public places like the Nazis did against the British in World War II. This is an evil regime. And the quicker they're gone, the better. And the people of Iran hopefully will eventually make their own decision about the future of their country. But we wanted to take away that real threat. And that's what the president chose to do. And as you and I talked about, Jasmine, we need to have a full debriefing of what happened and why and find out what was accurate. Because remember, whether it be Hillary Clinton or George W. Bush, some of the stories that came out of Iraq proved to be inaccurate. And so that's the frustration where we need to elevate our transparency in this country to gain the trust back of the people. And I think that's just common sense. But I do think I happen to side with Bob from Arkansas. I think this was a preemptive move to make sure they never acquired that nuclear weapon to terrorize the world.
And so, a result of this, obviously, has been over the last few days is that Israel struck Iran's South Pars gas field, prompting an Iranian retaliatory strikes on the Qatar side of that same gas hub, and a missile barrage on Verdaya. The oil field is shared by Iran, Qatar, the biggest in the world. From your state, the Daytona Beach News Journal reports that Florida gas prices on Tuesday jumped an average of 13.2 cents overnight, with regular gas topping $4 a gallon in parts of the state. I wonder, what's your response to Americans who say that the cost is becoming too much because of the war? And do you have concerns about the impact on U.S. oil and gas prices?
Of course I do. I mean, it's a real hard thing because, again, we went through 4 years of high inflation under Joe Biden. As you remember, it reached over 9%. I also want to make sure people remember just a few years ago when the Biden, during 2022, gas prices adjusted for inflation were over $150. And the same thing happened when Barack Obama was president. Gas prices, I think, got to $147 per barrel adjusted for inflation. And that was over a longer period of time.
Now they say that if it goes to late April, the barrels could be 180.
Again, I don't disagree at all. And that's why we're optimistic this conflict can end soon. But the other thing we're doing, unlike in the previous administrations, is that we're becoming more self-reliant on our own energy needs. That's why we've opened up opportunities with shale production, why we're working more closely with places like Venezuela to use their heavier crude to get those prices down, and looking for more opportunities and having an all-in energy solution. Because, again, we need to be less reliant in general on the Middle East. But I think if we can end this conflict quickly, we'll get those prices down. Right now, before I went on the show, I think they're about $93, $94 a barrel. The average this year is between $72 and $85 a barrel, so it's up. But we're optimistic it will come back down, and it's still a heck of a lot less than it was during the Biden years and the Obama years.
Have you heard from your constituents that they're concerned about paying, $4 a gallon again?
Well, you don't have to hear from the constituents. I'm concerned about it too. And this is an everyday issue, and again, this is hopefully an aberration. And once we end this conflict, we can reduce those prices down to the levels they're at just a month or so ago. That's our goal. But the other part of this is not just what's happening in the Middle East. We need to become energy independent. We all learned during COVID that we became too dependent on other parts of the world. And that's why we're seeing these new investments being made here in America. And the other good news is that since President Trump has come back into office, I think around $17 trillion in foreign investment has come into America. So we've become more independent on things like, let's just say, computer chips, for example.
Bruce from Kingston, New York, a Democrat. You're next. Good morning, Bruce.
Yeah, good morning. Hello, C-SPAN fans and the rest of America. I'd like to point out, I don't want to get involved in the Republican sales talk, but the fact of the matter is the only people who are blowing up the world is Putin, Netanyahu, and now Trump, and with American financing behind the bombs that are coming down. We're also paying for Israeli destruction and the machine that just took care of Gaza and is now turning Lebanon, southern Lebanon, into another Gaza. I watched the BBC report live last night with a reporter dodging, problems coming down, was walking through southern Lebanon that looked like, and she literally said, this feels like Armageddon. Now, that's what basically is really going on. If we destroy the state of Iran, which is what Israel really wants, to break it down like Gaza and essentially create a no man's land, we're going to have 93 million people who are across the Middle East going to be very angry, and that's going to be for the next 50 years. In the meantime, we're letting Russia, we're refinancing Russia with...
All right, Bruce, I'm going to let the Congressman, we're coming up on some time, and let the Congressman respond to that.
Well, look, we all want to end this conflict as quickly as possible. We all also remember it happened just a couple of years ago on October 7th. and that was funded by Iran. And they are the state sponsor of terrorism in my entire lifetime. And again, I can't stress enough, look what they do to their own people. If they do this to their own citizens, you could only imagine what they might do to the rest of the world, and how they're bombing places that could be their friends. And again, it's very telling that all the nations that surround Iran have had enough of Iran, that they're siding with the United States and Israel, who had been a longtime enemy of theirs. And so I think Bruce's point is well taken. We hate to have these conflicts around the world, but when you confront evil, it's not easy. And as we all learn, as again a history teacher myself, when you don't confront evil, you have situations like Nazi Germany. Remember, Chamberlain appeased the Nazis, and I don't know, like 200 million people died in the process.
Doug from Las Vegas, Nevada, a Republican. You're next. Good morning, Doug.
Hello. Hey, I'm glad you're talking about all these money issues and stuff, because I really don't care about this war. That's just a blip on the screen. I'm more concerned with the continuing resolutions that our Congress and our Senate use to not do their jobs. Why don't you vow? I don't know if this guy, what his personal politics are, but I know anybody who goes to sit in the Senate or the Congress and votes for continuing resolutions are voting for something that just gives something to cover their butt and not do their job. If they can't do the budget without continuing resolutions, I ran a budget my whole life. I worked poor my whole life. I can retire now because I saved my money. Y'all don't know how to make a budget, I don't think. That's why you use CRs. I hate the elected officials in these big groups that will not do their job. Their main job is to make a budget. They haven't done that for years.
All right, Doug, I think we get your point. Let's have the congressman respond.
Well, good question. Remember, they've not passed a normal budget since 1997. As Doug may or may not know, I'm a new member of Congress. I came from Florida, where we actually balanced budgets. When I was leader of the Senate, we had a budget shortfall, so what did we do? We spent less. We didn't raise taxes when people could at least afford it. But the good news, for if you don't know this, like everything except DHS no longer has a continuing resolution. This is the last piece of the pie, and I think that's a positive step. We no longer have to live in what a Republican would say, the Biden budgets. These are our budgets now. We've reduced the amount of spending, in the big, beautiful bill by about $1.5 trillion. And the last piece of the pie, Doug, is this last debate about DHS funding, which Jasmine and I are talking about. My number one long-term goal we talked about last time, Jasmine, is to have a balanced budget amendment. It makes elected officials make the tough decisions. And I'm glad to see we're moving away from continual resolutions so that the election results decide the future of the country, not what happened in prior administrations.
All right, Congressman, we've got to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us. Congressman Mike Haridopolos of the Financial Services and Science, Space, and Technology Subcommittee Chair. Thanks so much for being with us.
Great to see you. Thank you.